So before we delve into part two in this three-part set on detachment, let me preface it to amend a misspeak from part one, where I said, detachment in the philosophical context has nothing to do with the management of emotions for practical applications, nor of the emotional disorders of broken psychologies, but has everything to do with severe clinging attachments that inevitably bring deep suffering. And while that may make sense, in a sense, as it may be also true, it doesn't convey what I was really intending. So I clarify. I said severe, but I misspoke and meant to say severing. So restated. Detachment in the philosophical context has nothing to do with the management of emotions for practical applications, nor of the emotional disorders of broken psychologies, but has everything to do with severing clinging attachments that inevitably bring deep suffering. So this brings us forward, but let us briefly recap. So last time we were talking about what exactly detachment is. We differentiated between philosophical and psychological detachment, the former being a conscious discipline, the latter being mostly of existential malfunction. We discussed how people are naturally inclined unconsciously to try and keep each other in delusion, by way of characterizing detachment as something negative, or to dismiss it as some kind of naive, unrealistic ideal. We considered how avoidance and ignoring are not at all related to detachment, as both of these behaviors are really just aversions masked as divestment. And we briefly outlined the questions surrounding abstinence and self-denial, which don't solve the problem, for they address the wrong areas of focus, which means that the only real thing these types of approaches translate into is self-oppression. Picking up from here, we can see how these types of tendencies, that is, the intellectual coping mechanisms we employ to stave off confronting and mastering our attachments, also tie into another common related idea that is completely off base. The notion that setting out to destroy or outlaw objects of desire will assist in maintaining some kind of existential integrity, as a lack of self-denial or abstinence from certain objects of desire reflects a lack of moral turpitude. This is the same type of false mentality that constitutes the approaches of avoiding or ignoring. We don't need to destroy or outlaw objects of desire, as any object in and of itself isn't the problem. Any imagined manifested representation in existence has an open-ended possible alignment. It is always the intent of the practitioner that determines the nature of such an application. This means no object is inherently good or evil. Objects are neutral. How you choose to employ an object will determine the nature of the causation. If you think you have identified some kind of object that is completely restricted to one kind of nature, all it reveals is that you are looking at its utility with a very narrow perspective. And let us not forget that some perspectives are yet to be revealed, due to the agency being temporarily restricted to a position within the confines of a smaller perspective. And that's without even addressing the problem of good or evil. How that sometimes, ironic as it may seem, A good results in an evil, or an evil results in a good. Not to mention that sometimes evil masquerades as good and demonizes the good as evil. And a lot of this depends on who you ask and what angle you want to slant the truth towards. The subjective relativity of the whole thing revealing a wholly mental signature. And if purely mental, then what object? There are no objects existing anywhere. So the problem isn't the so-called object. The problem is that which feels compelled to form attachments to objects of desire. This is the area to be addressed. So, if not to destroy or outlaw evil objects of desire, then maybe abstain or self-deny. Would this constitute detachment? Abstinence and self-denial are just forms of self-punishment. But I know what you are thinking. How could anyone possibly become enlightened if they drink alcohol? Are not the masters of wisdom from the ages always necessarily sober and austere? No, not necessarily. Don't get stuck on thinking that an enlightenment must look a certain way. A spiritual master can drink alcohol and have sex, but keep that quiet. No one is supposed to know that. To strictly deny oneself the flow of experience is contrary to our function, and sucks all the life out of existence. Abstinence, while indeed arduous, isn't mastering the mind. So even if you are following 12 steps, have amassed 20,000 recovery medallions, and have 20 years plus sober, while definitely admirable, you still have not conquered alcoholism. When you can have a drink and not feel the need to obsessively seek to repeat the experience again and again in an averting attempt to cover over your problems with a blur of intoxication, you will have finally truly overcome alcoholism. Addiction isn't a disease. That's an externalization. Addictions are attachments that ravage the body and destroy personal relationships, like a disease. And while Western medicine may implore that a drug can change the brain with prolonged use, fortunately, the neuroplasticity of the brain means that it can, over time, always relearn and make new organizational adjustments based on new experiences. So the way to master the mind doesn't involve avoiding experiences. Huh? Wait a minute, does that mean any experience? Ah, yes, we knew this one was coming, didn't we? Don't homogenize the non-denial of experience to signify an endorsement for actions of evil. But why? Why not evil? The wise do not practice evil, because delusional behaviors always enable a descent into deeper layers of delusion, making it much more difficult to self-recognize. You only hurt yourself with delusional behaviors, in any and every sense of it. Quite literally, you only hurt yourself with evil, as there is only one here. And if you think you can impose a negative experience on an other and not have to eventually live through the receiving end of that very same experience, then you truly are delusional. So it might help to take the golden rule a little more literally. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, because they are already you, and you are them. But wait, will this work? Obviously, there are many of us out there that self-hate and continually engage in practices that deface and degrade ourselves. What becomes of the golden rule when one is consumed with self-loathing? Yes, this is always a possibility. Hence why I have modified the golden rule with a little modern upgrade. We can call it the Golden Rule 2.0. Don't do unto others anything unless you have their permission first. If you can understand and follow this, even if you hate yourself, and want to extend that same hate to others, it might save you a lot of wasted time accruing even more of a counterproductive, deeply negative condition that you would clearly not be in favor of if you had the proper clarity of mind. And the predisposition of consciousness wanting to open itself up to enlightenment isn't derived from merely a subjective opinion, as it is a natural configuration of its nature, in much the same way as water moving to flow downhill, or electricity always traveling the path of least resistance. Much the same could be said of lucidity. Illumination reveals the interconnected oneness of all that is, and with enough of this type of clarity established, delusional traps can be seen exactly for what they are, that which would facilitate ignorance and delusion. And this isn't sought, not because of a denial of experience, or of the avoidance of ignorance or delusion, but because it just wouldn't become a naturally occurring factor due to not being in accord with the truth. It's the same reason you don't see birds trying to rip off their own wings, or why you just never seem to get the urge to eat your own feces, or the reason you don't see water flowing uphill. It isn't in accord with the truth. So you can nip that one right in the bud. The use of detachment for evil isn't detachment, as any evil is necessarily filled with lust, cravings, and desires, which can only find their contextual significance within delusion. This is why detachment in a philosophical sense does not lead to evil as one might commonly come to mistakenly believe, through the integration of concepts about apathy and psychopathy. Evil requires attachment, despite the similar, commonly mistaken belief that incorporates concepts of emotional investment with benevolence. You see, I disagree with a common school of thought, often held by psychologists and criminal profilers, that psychopaths and sociopathic personalities lack empathy. It's a misconception. They have empathy. It's just been buried. or compartmentally reserved for specific circumstances, as the case may be. If you were to test most psychopaths, you will find that the majority of them will experience empathy and react accordingly. If you were to perhaps propose a suggestion of evil or injustice to be visited upon their own families, if they were completely devoid of empathy, would it not follow that they simply wouldn't give a shit if their own mother, or even their own children for that matter, were being victimized? Yet the majority of them have strong emotional reactions to such hypothetical scenarios. Psychopaths are not detached, even in the pure negative psychological sense. They are very visceral. Cruelty may seem detached because it's cold, but cold isn't empty. Cold cruelty is an investment. Mean-spiritedness satisfies something within them that they prefer over being mindful, compassionate, and empathetic. A dark desire that's gratification completely overpowers the innate sense of connectedness. But it doesn't mean that sense of connectedness isn't somewhere still within them. Indeed, many psychopaths have families, wives, children, and all. And while there may be a very few depraved individuals out there who might not express concern about their own families, who may indeed hate their own families. But even in those rare cases, I would posit that, again, the empathy is just very deeply covered over by numerous layers of corrupting factors, which could include trauma, abuse, anxiety, anger, hatred, and, more often than not, the transfixing allure of paraphilic interests. Indeed, I would attribute paraphilias, a condition characterized by abnormal sexual desires involving criminal behavior or extreme dangerous activities, to be the main facet that acts to subdue and bury empathy in order to account for its own dark desires. No matter how they were originally acquired, paraphilias are attachments, as they are an intense craving, just as any desire is. Only they are sexual practices that involve very abnormal conditions, such as sexual gratification that is dependent on a non-consenting individual, such as burglary, rape, and murder, or on very bizarre, risky fetishes, such as scat, cannibalism, or necrophilia. It is the psychopath's passion to achieve these ever-escalating insidious cravings that force him to selectively apply empathy, using his own twisted desires as the justification to suspend his own innate emotions that would otherwise recoil in horror. The main point here, in case some of you are worried that I've gone off on a tangent, is that evil is always sustained by desire and attachment, not contentment and detachment, as the opponents of detachment would like you to believe. They would like you to believe this because it contributes to upholding the foundation of delusion, which everyone is automatically conditioned to maintain at all costs. So much so that often, even so-called spiritual guides will deliberately give you a bum steer and try to divert you away from detachment, as it wouldn't be very conducive to selling you the workshops, books, and DVDs. It goes a little something like this. Detachment is pointless, because eventually detachment will become just another attachment, and then you'll be right back where you started from. So, what's the point of detachment? Sound familiar? There may be a tiny caveat warranted within this concept that perhaps represents a small kernel of truth, but the majority of it is hyperbolic misdirection, of which a lot of theistic Hindus would reinforce and agree, as they are heavily invested in their attachments to God, divinity, dogma, and cultural traditions. And of course, to the delight of the contradiction with the Buddha, who rejected their religion to ultimately go on to find out the truth for himself. Which brings us to one of the Buddha's most famous allegories, the parable of the raft, which, in closing, I will briefly outline for you now. Here, the Buddha explains that his teaching is for the purposes of crossing over, not for the purpose of grasping. He tells the story of a man standing near a great expanse of water. The near shore is dangerous, but the far shore, often identified by the Buddha as a metaphor for nirvana in his teaching, is a place of safety. The man constructs a raft to make it to the far shore. Then, after reaching the far shore, decides to carry the raft around on his head and shoulders everywhere he goes. The Buddha then asks the monks if the man is doing what should be done with the raft. The monks, seeing the point, reply, no. The Buddha then explains that the man must let go of the raft in the end. Similarly, his teachings is not something for the purposes of more clinging and attachment. It is a means of reaching the far shore. The teaching is a vehicle, not the destination. Even attachments to the teachings can become an obstacle. And finally, the Buddha adds, when you know you should abandon even the teachings in the end, how much more so the things contrary to the teachings.